Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us here in the lovely Macquarie Auditorium. And as always, a big thank you to Macquarie for graciously lending us this fantastic venue for tonight's talk. Tonight's event promises to be a fascinating one, being as it is the second in our series of evening lectures on the entitlement. And tonight's event seeks to answer the question whether there is any such thing as ethical technology. The very notion of ethics in technology raises interesting questions. Other than perhaps teenage boys feeling somewhat outraged that their computer game has cheated, very few people argue that technology has its own inner morality. And yet, while obvious examples of interaction between ethics and technology arise in areas such as medical research and bioethics, the phrase ethical technology is used in a number of different contexts, and each with different overtones. One of tonight's speakers, Nick Cater, alluded to such an example in his column in The Australian Today, when he spoke about rent seekers and the renewable energy target. Proponents of the RET often claim that green technology is somehow more ethical and morally superior, and so deserving of greater taxpayer support. This is based on the notion that green energy is somehow more morally right than other types of technology. And we've seen this sense of absolute moral superiority extend on the other side to very illiberal means of shutting down unethical industries such as the coal industry and other energy technologies. Yet can it be morally right to deny those living in abject poverty the life-saving improvements that cheap and reliable energy will bring? Now, these questions are not easy, as any discussion of the ethics of technology must, by necessity, address broader questions such as the interaction between personal morality, personal freedoms, and reasonable community-wide ethical standards. These were key themes arising from the Enlightenment period, and they remain bound up in some of the most intense personal and national conflicts of today. It is remarkable to see how cultures and countries whose views on the rights of women have resisted hundreds of years of human progress and who violently reject so-called Western democratic values and ethics, how those same groups have shown much less reluctance to adopt modern weapons technology. The jihadi against Western imperialism is published on YouTube and is subtitled in English. It seems that in some cases, ethics are more flexible in the face of technological improvement. So should we have a free-for-all and let the ethical chips fall where they may? Well, debating that topic tonight are three excellent speakers who will each present a different take on this topic. Nick Cater has just been appointed Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, and Nick is the driving force of the Enlightenment program at the CIS. He's currently completing his second book, a sequel to last year's Lucky Culture, and Nick spent 24 years at News Corp, with 9 years in senior editorial positions at The Australian, including editing The Weekend Australian, and several years as a News Corp correspondent in Asia. He started his career at the BBC, but migrated to Australia where he first worked on the Adelaide Advertiser way back in 1989. Dr. Ryan Messmore is the president of Campion College. Before coming to Australia, Dr. Messmore served as a research fellow in religion and free society at the Heritage Foundation, based in Washington, DC. His research and writing examined how religious commitments are brought to bear on political life and to improve public discourse and strengthen civil society. He received his doctorate in political theology from Oxford University, and last, but by no means least, he delivered the 2012 Acton Lecture for the CIS, where he discussed what type of religion is free in today's public square. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague Helen Andrews, who is a policy analyst in our Social Foundations program. Helen is a blogger at First Things and has had articles on religion and conservatism published in the National Review, the American Spectator, the Weekly Standard, the New York Post, and the American Conservative. Helen is a former associate editor of the National Review and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Studies from the prestigious Yale University. Her first paper for the CIS on the abolition of the charities watchdog is still riling feathers everywhere, so we can only hope that this, her first speech for the CIS, will have the same influence and response. Nick will speak first tonight, and then Dr. Messmore, finally Helen, and after which we'll have time for some Q&A. So think up some great questions to ask these guys. And without further ado, I'd like to ask Nick to kick off.
Thank you, Simon. I might start just by giving a brief overview of this Enlightenment project, where this fits in, before moving on to think what is a first for the CIS. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a look at the ethics of ferroconcrete. More of that in a minute, but we started this discussion a few months back when Brendan O'Neill was in town, and we were looking at really what was great about the Enlightenment and why an organisation like the Centre for Independent Studies would hold it in such high regard, because it is indeed the great breakthrough in man's thinking, which led to the scientific, industrial, economic, material and social progress that we've seen in the last 250 years. Before the Enlightenment, the nature of science, or attitudes to science, of course, were very different. It wasn't so much through observation and experiment that we came to the truth, but through revelation, through divine revelation, or at least through the revelation provided by God's officers on earth. So there was always this higher moral dimension to science. It was the divine, the things that were set by the deity. There was a notion of truth and heresy, and if a scientist deviated from that line, then of course they're in trouble, as indeed Galileo was when he came up with his theories about the nature of the sun and the planets, when he wrote that the sun is the centre of the world and completely devoid of local motion. Now, that got him into trouble with the Roman Inquisition, which was there to sort of keep the political correctness of the time in line. And they came up with the assessment on what Galileo said. They said that this proposition is foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture according to the literal meaning of the words. So Galileo was in effect silenced. He'd gone too far, and at a time when the church was in a position really to dictate the limits of science. This, of course, changes completely within 100 years of Galileo's writing, with the dawn of the Enlightenment and the birth of empiricism, this new way of knowing things, and this real faith in human reason, that human reason was capable of working out truth, that human reason was capable of finding science, developing science and technology, and later industrial progress that would lead to the great social progress of mankind. The age of reason was an age where there was no God in the machine, if you like. It was a soulless machine that didn't need God to explain the gaps of our understanding. It gave birth to this great idea of progress, which I find reading about so refreshing in the 19th century, when really people came up with, there was so much going on in terms of science and industry, the steam engine, everything that followed from it, the many developments. There was the much in social progress too, the abolition of slavery, the improvement of working conditions, the abolition of child labour. They managed to do all this and yet continue to produce goods more and more efficiently in abundance that were traded. We had the birth of trade, of course, the birth of really developed forms of finance that allowed capital to go where it was most needed. All this combines in the 19th century to produce this great growth in wealth and progress, starting, of course, with certain countries, starting principally with the United Kingdom, but spreading outwards. through trade and through the swapping of ideas, so that by the end of the 19th century, you're really beginning to see the end of want. It hasn't yet ended, there's still famine in the world, but people can see that this may indeed be possible, particularly with the invention of things like frozen food technology, which allowed frozen meat to be transported from Australia to Britain for the first time in the 1870s. And by 1900, within 20 years, the British diet, there was 6 times the amount of meat in the British diet in 1900 than there was in 1880. All of the result of this progress which has gone on. And an idea starts to set in that progress is somehow inevitable, that we'll just keep going and going and getting better and better and better. There's a wonderful introduction to a book called The Idea of Progress by J.B. Berrien. It's written by the historian Charles A. Beard, and he sets it out this way. Until people prefer hunger rather than plenty, disease rather than health, technology will continue to be dynamic. Curiosity will have to die out in human nature before technology could become stagnant. Today, I think, less than 100 years after that book was written, I'm beginning to suspect that the wheel has turned again, and that our ideas on science have changed again, that our faith in science and technology is no longer unconditional. We no longer believe in the infinite path of progress, but it's conditional. We think that scientific discovery and application is no longer inherently good. It needs to be subject to a higher justification because it can bring bad as well as good to mankind. It's the idea that unbounded scientific progress can get us into trouble. We sometimes push things too far. And this sets in, interestingly enough, I think, well before the First World War. Although, of course, many of the developments in the 20th century, I think, gave us cause to pause and hesitate about where science and technology was taking us, with specifically 2 world wars that were driven by technology and all the evil that flowed from them. I turn to the national curriculum, or the draft version that has been put out, and I notice this conditional idea of science is running right through it. A nervous, sort of apprehensive idea that science is no longer there to excite us, but it can also terrify us. And in the year 7 science module, for instance, they say, science and technology contribute to finding solutions to a range of contemporary issues. So far, so good. These solutions may impact on other areas of society and may involve ethical considerations. So here we have imposed once again this idea that there's a natural order to things which we mustn't offend. And it set me thinking about this whole idea of ethical technology. That's the question that's before us today, of course. Is there such a thing of ethical technology? Are some lines of scientific investigation and application, nuclear power, for instance, genetically modified crops, stem cell technology, the mining of coal, perhaps even, are these things which are inherently bad because they take us on the road to disaster? That would seem to be the implication of much of today's debate. I thought perhaps one way to look at this is to take a technology which is perhaps a little less controversial than nuclear power, and that is reinforced concrete. It came up recently in discussion with Roger Scruton when he gave a very interesting session in Melbourne on the idea of modern architecture. And Scruton made the point, I think slightly playfully, that what the big downfall of modern architecture was the invention of reinforced concrete. And you can see how perhaps when you look around at the brutalism in the cities around us, right around the world, how it's tempting to come to that conclusion, and perhaps I was tempted to even share his view. But what of reinforced concrete? Is it a good, bad, or bad technology? Is it a force for good or a force for evil in the world? Well, it was invented in 1867 by a Frenchman, Joseph Monnier, who unveiled it at the Universal Exhibition in Paris that year. It didn't make too much of a splash because his application of reinforced concrete was in the production of flower pots, because he was a gardener, and he realised that if you took concrete and put wire mesh in it, it was virtually unbreakable. You could drop the things and they'd survive. So there began this great journey with reinforced concrete. The Germans got hold of Monnier's technology and he bought his patent, and suddenly the thing took off. Interestingly, the person that bought reinforced concrete to Australia was our own John Monash, who was an engineer, and his speciality was in concrete. He built a couple of really fine reinforced concrete bridges in the late 19th century, which are still standing. He built the first ever brewery out of reinforced concrete, Carlton United Brewery. I don't know whether that particular bit's still standing. He built the world's first swimming pool out of reinforced concrete at St Peter's College in Adelaide. And so it went on. People would come up with fantastic new inventions to make out of concrete that would just change the face of the world. The grain silo, for instance, in America, the idea that you could build a concrete grain elevator, massive elevator to store grain, that out of concrete rather than wood, it wouldn't catch fire, the wheat would be preserved, and that revolutionised the grain trade and again helped ease the problems of hunger in the rest of the world. It supplied wheat at a reasonable, cheap price to the British in particular. So many good things, of course, were coming out of reinforced concrete before World War I. But then things turned bad. The Germans have got hold of this, and of course they're very good, aren't they, at turning this stuff into very useful means. The first thing they did, of course, was get a very quick drying version, one that cured very quickly, so they could lay this cement very quickly and put their big guns on it, the big Bertha, and destroy whole Belgian towns in a day. And then they reinforced their trenches with it, and they became virtually indestructible. The Allies could just raise a whole town, all the trees, everything would be gone, but the concrete would stay. So arguably it prolonged the war for many years. It reinforced the stalemate and the death that followed. So is it ethical? Is it ethical? And then after World War I, of course, then Le Corbusier and the Bauhaus School of Architects gets hold of it and decides this is a coming thing, industrial buildings. You can build buildings on an industrial scale. You can get rid of all the fiddly bits and just have straight lines, and you get the birth of this brutalist architecture. And then in World War II again, I don't want to pin the Germans yet again, but they do use this stuff very well. I was in Saint-Nazaire in France recently looking at the buildings where they used to house the U-boats. And these are huge. These are the biggest concrete temples you ever imagined. The Allies, of course, tried bombing them and couldn't make a dent on them, so the U-boats continued to flourish, sinking merchant ships, bringing starvation, bringing death. Reinforced concrete again, and then perhaps, to my mind, the most hideous use of it I've ever seen, the gas chambers of Auschwitz. So we look at this stuff and we say, did anything good come out of it? Would have been better if mankind hadn't invented it. I put this to Roger Scruton and then played him my trump card. What do you think of the Opera House? And he had to quietly confess that it was a magnificent building of its type, that a real temple to the human spirit, a place where we can hear the best things that man's possible of creating. So I begin to come to the question: there is nothing inherently good or bad, ethical or unethical about any particular technology. It's what we do with it, and we need to resist this idea that there are certain no-go areas. I mentioned nuclear power, for instance. It's interesting, isn't it? When the Fukushima disaster happened, we had talk of another Chernobyl, and yet, if you look at the bare facts of it, the first Chernobyl was not really a Chernobyl in the way we imagine it. The death toll was relatively small. By small, I mean around about 120 confirmed deaths from it. There may be other radiation effects, but nothing has been so far concretely proved. So you begin to suspect that perhaps we're more terrified of nuclear power for other reasons. Perhaps it looms larger in our imaginations than is really justified. Aeroplanes, for instance, as we know, are dangerous things. We had a reminder of that recently, but they are much more safe than they once were. We now transport many more people because science and technology has been able to play its course. and we've been able to make each time every bit of information about aeroplanes and safety is channeled through to build safer and better aeroplanes. And I'm sure if we wanted, we could do the same with nuclear power, if there was a will there. And then quite recently I looked at the question of genetically modified crops, which again, to many people, is a technology which is a step too far, that's somehow going to unleash the power of nature to bring Gaia's forces raining down upon us. And in Britain quite recently, they've come up with a genetically modified potato that ends the prospect of the potato blight which brought famine to Ireland in the 19th century, brought tragedy and misery, and still does so today, incidentally. The potato blight still affects crops in places like Bangladesh, which had a bad bout of it recently. And this, when it occurs, of course, is a thoroughly bad thing for mankind. So the prospect of a genetically modified potato that could end this thing completely, surely, is something to be welcomed. But in today's nervous, risk-averse world, no. The European Union rules on the growing of genetically modified food are such that the developers of this potato think that it could be at least 10 years before they have any chance at all of growing it commercially, and that's if everything goes according to plan. So 10 more years of potato blight, all because of our nervousness over technology. And just to finish up on the genetically modified potato, and a chap, I hope I can pronounce his name right, Arpad Putzai is one of the European scientists who's really very opposed to genetically modified crops. And he expressed his fears to GeneWatch magazine about this particular potato in an extended interview. What exactly is the risk of the genetically modified potato? He said, "I think this is a really dangerous experiment with our globe, with our Gaia, with our people," he said. "And if you ask me what are the consequences, I can only say I haven't got the faintest idea. I'm not saying there's going to be a cataclysmic consequence of this. What I am saying is that the cataclysmic thing about it is we don't know what's going to happen." And in that very revealing quote, you see that it's a fear of the unknown. It's a fear that the future, a pessimistic fear that the future is going to turn bad, rather than the great optimism which powered science and technology in the 19th and early 20th century. So I'm going to argue that much of this talk of ethical technology really is another way of communicating an apprehension about the modern world, a fear about modernism, which is unfounded. We know it's unfounded because the cataclysmic consequences are no nearer happening than they were when people started raising objections to this 100 years ago or more. We need to reinvigorate our faith in technology and look for technological solutions to technological problems as they arise, and do away with the whole idea that there is good, bad, ethical and unethical technology. With that, I might hand over to Dr. Ryan Messmore, who I'm sure will have another take on this.